There we go. Okay.
Fine with
Oh,
me.
and now recording. So anyway, here we are, and I'm delighted to have the opportunity to converse more fully with a new acquaintance, Kostas Koliopoulos
That's right.
from uh, from Athens at the Panteion University there, a distinguished university of social sciences. And we became acquainted just a few weeks ago at an international conference on the topic of international relations. And I was very impressed by your insights on the state of things during the pandemic. So I wanted to have the opportunity to talk with you more in depth. So, welcome.
Thank you so much for this opportunity, Bill.
Well, very good. Yes, as I said, what you presented was very insightful as well as thought provoking, because your observations were very frank, and certainly in the case, as we will uh, discuss further, very direct as to the audience that we were speaking to. So,
This is one of the advantages of being an academic. You don't yield any power, but you do have the luxury of speaking freely.
you do have the voice, so let's have it get out there. Um, Also, I did ask you for your slides, which I was happy to receive very quickly, and then with the request to evaluate them or give my observations. So this fits very nicely. If we can, I was going to use that as a framework for our conversation, going through your slides, because I was very intrigued by them. So if that's agreeable to you, we'll just kind of I've got the slides here, and we'll.
That's a no big deal. Can do with them whatever you want.
Well, there were three slides, which again I said were very insightful in their bullet points, and I do hope that you can expand these bullet points, and you spoke to them very eloquently, into a full-length article in some learned journal.
Whenever I find time for this, it's very
Well,
pressing nowadays.
right. So, what have you been busy with just before we get into the conversation? Is this
Well, it's I need to be promoted to full professor as soon as possible. So I'm currently writing a book about, let's say, the rules of strategy, some bits and pieces of strategic wisdom, if you like. Hopefully, we'll have it finished by January or February,
uh,
and then I will have plenty of time, I reckon.
right? And which languages will this be available in this book?
For the time being, it's gonna be available only in Greek.
Uh-huh.
You fellows will have to wait a little bit to get some of it in English.
Right.
But right now, you see, it's I really need to rush.
Of course. Well, I
I'm
thank you
studying
for
my mother tongue.
taking the time to talk with me this morning. So, um, I was very intrigued by one of your first points, which was the primacy of the nation state.
Mhm.
And this is something which, in some quarters, I think can be overlooked. We have so many international organizations and international institutions and regional arrangements. Um, but along the way, perhaps, the nation state, as a very critical component of international relations, some people may overlook the power of that. So, can you perhaps explain a little bit more about the primacy of the nation state?
Okay, it has been fashionable during the last few decades to talk about the decline or even the demise of the nation states. And there were quite a few people far wiser than I am who said, guys, what are you talking about? It is nation states that possess nuclear weapons. They still have the capability of blowing up the planet. They can move troops around. They can even, to a certain extent, print their own money. Look what President Barack Obama did in a few years ago when he was in financial straits. And because it's the US dollar, of course, it will be accepted throughout the world. So it was really fashionable to talk about the decline of the states. And now the coronavirus brought home the point that the nation state still remains the ultimate arbiter. The ultimate arbiter. It's people are still loyal to the nation states, more or less. It is to the nation state that they were looking and are still looking out for help. Nobody
Right.
started crying, oh, where's the United Nations? What can the United Nations do for us? No, everybody started talking about what the nation state could do for them, either at the federal level in the United States or at state level. And in unitary states like Greece or Italy, everybody was really looking up to the government.
Right. Well, one thing that has been remarked upon is the rise of nationalist sentiment, particularly in Europe. The rise of nationalist type leaders, whether this is in Poland or Hungary. You could even make that case, I think, in the UK. So is the rise of nationalist leaders, and they could be called something else too, but is that a contributing factor to a new recognition of the primacy of the nation state?
Absolutely. You see, people tend to get organized into groups, and the nation state. Now we know that we use these terms interchangeably. Of course, we do know the differences. Nation is a community of people. Let's give a definition. Nation is a community of people who believe that they have a common destiny um, during during centuries, whereas state, as once again we all know, is a legal construct. So, but we will use those terms interchangeably, right? So, it is very interesting that people were very dismissive of people. Mainly political theorists were very dismissive as regards nation. Oh, nation, that's old-fashioned stuff. But actually, this is how people think. They do tend to get organized into groups. They're still very loyal to the nation. So I don't think that the rise of nationalist leaders, or call them whatever you want, I don't think this is an aberration. And it's not only a European phenomenon. We saw this in the United States. We saw this in Brazil. We've been seeing this for years in East Asia. Even in Japan, you have those prime ministers visiting the Yasukuni shrine. Now, what's that? It is a shrine which honors the Japanese war dead. And there were some Second World War criminals buried there. But okay,
Right.
it's right or wrong, my country.
Right.
So the same in China, in Philippines, in Thailand, in India, for God's sake.
A
So
very good
this is
point,
not
I
an
think,
aberration.
with India also. I mean, that's becoming a Hindu state where, you know, an element of what a nation state is for a group is a common religion or a common language. Those are very important factors.
And this started more than about 3 decades ago.
Yeah.
There's no recent development, but people had somehow been turning a blind eye to this.
Right.
Oh, well, this is third world stuff. We're more advanced than that. Yeah, right. Okay.
Yeah.
Look at what we're seeing now. You could see Germany, for instance, hoarding medical equipment. Many other countries doing the same thing because, first and foremost, a government has to take care of its people. A state has to take care of the prime nation
That's right.
that comprises it.
Well, of course, one of the many phrases that President Trump used in his campaign and then while he was president was you had to have secure borders. because if you don't have secure borders, you can't be a country. So that's kind of a subsidiary thought that comes from the concept of the nation state.
Once again, this goes without saying. And let me repeat, there were the so-called transnational groups were much in vogue during quite a few decades, actually. Communist parties were supposedly internationalists. Of course, the Communist Party of the Soviet Union was very nationalist indeed, very Russian nationalist. But okay, the rest of the world tended to forget that. So there is this talk about some transnationalist groups saying that, well, borders are the problem, immigrants are the purpose, immigrants are the goal. And okay, you may say whatever you want, but you see, when you deal with social reality, you have to accept what public opinion is, not that you might want it to be. So once
Right,
again, I don't have any fetish with the state or with borders or like that, but that's what people think. And in the end of the day, in the social sphere, this is what matters.
right. Well, point well taken. Another of your points about the trends during this COVID period was about the erosion of U.S. leadership. And how does that manifest itself? What would be the main manifestations of the erosion of U.S. leadership?
Well, for better or for worse, the United States has been held in higher standard than other countries. Let's say President Vladimir Putin a few days ago gave a very interesting press conference commenting the settlement of Nagorno-Karabakh war. It's a very interesting press conference. I'll forward it to you. It's very, as they call it in international relations theory, very realist stuff. Look, we have the interests of Russia. That's why we care about. Sorry, guys, people died. Stuff happens. And now we have to settle the whole thing, always protecting the Russian national interests. Very hardcore stuff, right? Now, when President Trump said something similar in the United Nations General Assembly, there was a furor throughout the world. Oh, the United States only care about itself. Oh, what a greedy state, and all this stuff. So you see, what has been considered normal for every other state in the world has somehow been considered, was considered abnormal for the United States. So people were expecting the US to take a leadership role in fighting COVID-19, and it didn't.
Right.
So it may, or it's probably unfair to your country, the United States of America, that somehow it only tried to fend for itself. But people throughout the world, and in the United States as well, have been led to expect otherwise. So for better or for worse, people were expecting American leadership, that the US should lead the world in doing something, and the United States didn't do anything of the sort. Actually, there was, I don't want to intervene in your domestic affairs, but there was something of a mix-up in the American response to the new coronavirus. So, well, if the Americans cannot really mend their own affairs, what can the rest of the world expect from them? This is the uproot. This is the main idea.
Right, right. Yeah.
Maybe you didn't like to hear this, but
No, well, we have to
it's
be
not really
honest
fair.
about it,
It's not
about
fair.
the situation. Well, that's a very interesting perspective to have. And perhaps another president, another person would have a more international point of view, at least articulating that, but that was not the case. So that leads us, of course, to your next point, which is about China, from disaster to victory. So let's first talk about the perceived or actual disaster, and then what the potential victory is. So what was the disaster for China
Okay.
that was perhaps more perceived? than
Older
actually.
hands, older hands like me and you still remember the Chernobyl disaster in the former Soviet Union. It really set in motion a very pernicious train of events as far as the Soviet leadership was concerned. They proved unable to deal with this, and so it was kind of the beginning of the end for the USSR. So initially, when we had this uncontrollable outbreak of the coronavirus in China, uh, people you might have come across it this yourself. People were making this analogy between the Chernobyl disaster and the COVID-19. What
Oh,
Chernobyl was for the USSR, maybe COVID-19 would be for communist China, and it was fairly widespread. So this is a disaster, really. And it was also a public relations disaster because people have this idea that China is, okay, it's an authoritarian state, nobody denies that, but it's somehow smoothly functioning. It's developing economically, has increasing clout politically. And then what do we see? We see people dying. The Chinese authorities denying that there was ever a problem with the coronavirus. We saw these enormous areas being deserted, being blockaded, cordoned off. So that was really a disaster, both in terms of human cost and probably even worse as far as the Chinese leadership is concerned in terms of public relations. So far, so much about the disaster. Now, about the victory. And you see, I've put a question mark in my slides.
yes.
It's too early to tell yet. But so far, China does seem to be doing much better than the rest of the world. So this can be, if everything turns out in the end for the Chinese, this may be a huge propaganda victory for authoritarian regimes. You see, we can deal with emergencies far better than your so-called democracy can.
Right.
And that's a big argument, right?
It is, and it's a strong argument, right? There was a sense that they dealt with matters very directly, immediately, severely, and then they stemmed the spread of the disease. Well, that's what they were saying they were successful in doing, stemming the disease in their country.
No.
Would an element of the victory also be their offer of provisioning various supplies, medical supplies to other countries? Have they been able to do enough of that to appear as a source of help and healthcare?
If the supplies do not turn out to be defective,
Uh,
because there has been a lot of talk about that. Oh, look, defective stuff from China. You know what Chinese product means internationally. When we say that, oh, this is made in China, what do we mean? We mean that it's, okay, apart from the factual statement, right? That something is really Chinese.
right.
When we hear that, oh, this is made in China, it means that it's cheap and not very reliable.
Right.
So I'm sure they will get over this. And this is something that you may not be aware of. This was the very definition of American product in the 19th century. Well, it's American, it's cheap, yeah, right, I'll give you that, but it's not very good. You should buy British instead.
Well, that's right. Well, that's true. I mean, the quality was the British manufacturers were highly regarded.
Absolutely. Nowadays, though, American is made with pride in the United
Right.
States, is a synonym of top quality, right?
Right.
So
It is.
people, we might expect that the Chinese will also reach a similar level. I don't know when. So
Right.
if the medical supplies that they send do not prove to be defective, if they are of reasonable quality, you don't need top quality in this respect, then yes, of course, they will have scored another propaganda point.
If they're successful, yes. Well, we were in, of course, an environment of a conference stage in Russia, and you raised the point about the challenges for Russian foreign policy, kind of in two dimensions, the short to medium term, and then the longer term. And so for Russian foreign policy, and I think Americans need to look at foreign policy from the Russian standpoint. What's their perspective? And of course, you can say some of this is propaganda or self-serving, but it has a validity. So for Russian foreign policy, um, what is the challenge from the West as you spoke of it? Challenge from the West.
Well, I can see now there is this old Chinese saying that goes, to be able to see the sun and the moon is not a sign of good eyesight, right? So I'm right now stating the obvious that I expect the West and the Russia to remain at loggerheads for the foreseeable future, and that's pretty bad if you ask me, uh, because they do need to cooperate in many respects. Now, I'm not gonna get to this discussion as who is to blame. I'm not assigning blame here, but the situation as it is that the West is afraid of Russia. Russia is afraid of the West, and I cannot see this changing anytime soon. So,
Right. Well, you know, going back to all the way back to, I guess it was 2012 in the presidential campaign, one of the candidates, the Republican candidate Romney, was asked in one of these debates, who is the greatest threat to the United States? And he said Russia. And of course, that was very controversial at the time, because even then there was a feeling maybe it was really China. But that probably came from some, deep feeling inside that we're afraid of Russia. And then with the 2016 campaign and the carryover, there was always this Russian meddling in the US, as well as allegations of Russian meddling in the Brexit vote.
yeah.
So the West is suspicious of Russia, but the Russians, feel that they're surrounded. And of course, they've been invaded by the West 3 times. Napoleon, and then of course Germany twice.
And
So
even
that's
quite a few times before that as well. You had the
right.
Swedes, you had the Poles,
Yeah,
even the Ottomans from the south, southwest. So okay, it's quite a few times. You see, I'm not willing to assign any blame, right?
right.
Definitely, the Russians have been mischievous regarding electoral meddling. This goes without saying. But on the other hand, this is what great powers do, right? The United States has been meddling in elections all around the world.
Right,
So
right.
there's a conflictual situation here. And as I cannot see this receding anytime soon, um, if I were a Moscow decision maker, this would preoccupy me the most.
Yes, right.
And
Well,
I don't have any solution.
another factor challenging the challenge for Russian foreign policy is Turkey and they intruding into the Russian neighborhood.
Now, I really want to qualify this because this was my initial, when I raised this point 2, 3 weeks ago. This was my initial reaction to the news of Turkish meddling in Nagorno-Karabakh war, and I was really astonished as to the apparent Russian inaction, because I saw Turkey, everybody saw Turkey playing a role, intervening in the post-Soviet space, and Moscow was doing nothing about this. So I said, hey, there might be a problem here. But now it's time for a more nuanced approach. It seems to me, and not only to me, I mean, I'm sharing this view with some eminent analysts, far more qualified than me to talk about those things, that Russia has been adjusting its role in the post-Soviet space. So they're still holding the trump cards in Nagorno-Karabakh. You see, when I made this point in the teleconference that we met in, the war was still going on. Now that it's settled, we see that Russia is still holding the keys to peace and war in the area. But of course, Turkey has definitely enhanced her role.
Yeah,
So,
right.
is this a challenge? I don't think it's so big as it used to look a few
Uh-huh.
weeks ago. So I really need to qualify what I said when in the heat of the battle, so to speak.
Right.
It's probably the Russian, people may believe whatever they want about the current Russian leadership, but there is one thing that has to be recognized about them. They have to get credit for their pragmatism.
Yes.
It's a very pragmatic leadership. You can call President Putin whatever you want. Call him authoritarian, call him election leader, call him psychopathic invader, as my Ukrainian friends have been calling him since
Right.
2014. But he's very pragmatic. See, he's willing to compromise to settle on his own terms, of course. So I shouldn't rate Turkey as a big challenge right now. But having in mind my next point, which is about the decline in Russian power, I can see Turkey becoming much more of a challenge in the years ahead.
If we stop there for a moment, going back, I wanted to ask you a question which I've been wondering about, which is about who is the designer and also the decider as far as Russian foreign policy is concerned. What is the role of Lavrov in the foreign policy development? Everything the U.S. is obsessed with Putin, but I think maybe one of the most, and I'll ask you your opinion, one of the most successful, well, maybe not necessarily that enduring and influential foreign ministers, I think, is Lavrov. And how do you view his role and his statecraft to the extent that he has it?
Now, it is only in retrospect that one has been able to work out the inner functioning of any Russian political system, be it Tsarist, be it Soviet, be it the current one. So you remember, of course, the so-called, the craft that was called Kremlinology or
Yes.
Sovietology.
Right.
And the guys were advancing the most crazy hypotheses. And in many cases, they were wide of the mark. They were somehow thinking that Podgorny, this old fellow, was a very important figure, etc., etc., etc. And Brezhnev wouldn't even bother consulting him. So I will not venture into modern day Kremlinology. I will
Right.
confess my ignorance of the inner workings of the top echelons of Russian leadership. I can see a very effective foreign minister in Mr. Lavrov. He's very effective. He's much more articulate than Gromyko.
Right, of course.
Okay, Andrei Gromyko.
Well, what caused me to ask that question was because we go back to the Nixon-Kissinger years, where, of course, Kissinger had been in charge of the National Security Council, advisor on foreign affairs to Nixon, and then eventually became Secretary of State. And various things occurred, successes, if you will, want to call them that, certainly turns of policy. And Nixon fancied himself as his own Secretary of State, but there certainly was speculation about whether certain policies were emanating from Kissinger or from Nixon. So that was a parallel I was curious about.
I think that Kissinger and Nixon were seeing eye to eye in many respects. So there was evidence of that at the time. The same obviously applies to Putin and Lavrov. we knew that this was not the case with Putin and Medvedev. When Medvedev was president, he what he did or what he allowed to be done in Libya clearly did not have Putin's approval. You know the story. There was this United Nations Security Council resolution that basically opened the war to NATO intervention. And Putin was furious when Medvedev, being president, he was in charge of foreign policy. And at that time, Putin really did play by the constitutional rules. So Medvedev really had the greatest say in foreign policy. And he allowed this resolution to be passed. And Putin was livid.
Right.
So this is definitely not the case with Lavrov at the time, but right now. It's
right.
So it's I don't know who's the let's say the initiator of foreign policy, but well, both of them are in complete agreement regarding Russian foreign policy.
That's a good point.
As it's now unfolding.
Right.
That's all I can say.
About a year or so ago, when I was in Russia, I was having dinner with someone who's become a friend, who is part of their exchange apparatus, if you will, with other countries. And he was someone that Lavrov worked for, this friend of mine. We'll call him Sergey. That is his real name. Anyway, they were both together in New York at the United Nations, and Lavrov was a step below this friend of mine. And I asked him this question, which I just asked you, about who's having the influence on who. And he looked at me almost insulted and maybe defensively. He said, they are both the same. They are doing this together. But anyway, so, well, if I may return to your comments about a Russian power.
With inside information. Not done with inside information. You ask me. I should be asking you quite a few questions on that. Okay, maybe another time.
Right. Right. So Russian power, the long-term challenge for Russian power, what do you see there?
Oh, come on, it's clearly declining. That's a no-brainer.
Right.
Okay. I might need to check my own data right now. If you give me a few seconds, because I really need to hammer home this point that Russian power is really in decline, and Putin has been doing a very good job with the hand he has been dealt with. But so let's see. The data is a little dated. It's about 2015, 2016. You may get updated stuff. So, but Russia's population is something in the region of 144 million people, right? It's number 9 in the world. Pakistan at the time was 190 million. Now they have, I know they are more than 200. Pakistan, which was number 6, right? And we still have countries like Nigeria overtaking Russia. So this is regarding population.
Right.
As regards the economy, Russia, in 2016, Russia was the 12th biggest economy in the world. I think it's still in the same place.
Right.
Something like 1/10 of the Chinese economy. 1/10.
I think I asked you this question, or
yes, absolutely. But I want to have it on record. You see,
right,
It's 1/3 of the German economy. Now, Putin has stated as one of his chief objectives to have Russia moved to the top 5 in the world. I was in this huge conference in Moscow, end of 2018 at the Financial University, and there was a lot of talk about this. There were some some big bankers, some ministers. There was a lot of stuff, a lot of people, and the consensus was they were fairly polite. They wouldn't put it in too insulting a way, but the consensus was, okay, our president wants this, but it cannot be done.
Right.
It cannot be done. This was the consensus. You see, the bankers were using very guarded language, but there was this Makarov, this guy from the Duma, who was really speaking his mind out, and he said, "Okay, come on, give me a break." People in Siberia and in the north still they don't have restrooms in their houses, and you're talking about the economy moving to the top 5. Give me a break. That's impossible. We cannot do it in the present situation. It was very harsh. Some Russian students that were translating for me, my Russian is not so good as to be able to understand what Makarov was saying, and they were astonished. They couldn't believe their eyes and ears. So,
right.
Economically wise, we have these problems. Defense expenditure. We're very close to the point that Saudi Arabia will be spending more money than Russia on defense.
Mm.
The gap between Russia, who's number 3 defense spender, and Saudi Arabia was something like $2 billion in 2016. I need to get my data updated, but you see, the core of the argument doesn't change.
The core of the argument, that's right. And I think defense spending is a critical metric.
Yep.
Critical metric.
Russian defense spending is about 1/3 of China's, and less than 1/10 of the United States defense spending. So it's really kind of funny. I shouldn't. I retract this. Kind of surprising to hear. He was senator at the time, right? Mitt Romney, in 2012, as you said, Russia is the biggest threat. Well, doesn't look like that on this paper.
That's right.
Having this data in mind,
it's
not so much of a threat there.
Yeah.
Okay, they do have these huge piles of stockpiles of nuclear weapons, but those weapons have been there since the late 50s. Actually, since late 40s, but the stockpiling began at the late 50s and the early 60s. So you have been living with Russian/Soviet nuclear weapons for something like 60 years?
Yes. Right. Yeah. Well, it's the challenge is there, and just the 4 points that you mentioned are very salient, and at some point the leadership has to do more than simply preserve its own power within the country. They've got to address these challenges. They're falling behind.
Yep, they're probably kicking the can down the road. This is what I see. Yeah. Okay, Putin. There's this term among the economists. It's called Putinomics. You may have heard of that. Putinomics. Yeah. So we don't aim for growth. Growth is kind of sluggish, hovering around 2% of the GDP per year. But we preserve more or less full employment. We retain those social benefits. So we reduce social tensions, and we're still a rich country, Russia, abundant resources. So we're living on them. And the future will have to look after itself.
Yeah, well,
this is what seems to me to be the Putin's economic strategy, Putinomics. Well, it may, I don't know, could be ecologically friendly. Who knows? But doesn't really guarantee you great power status.
Right. Yeah. Not. Yeah. Certainly, that's true. Well, you were, I think, very forthright in bringing up those points during the forum that you were speaking at.
I hope nobody was offended.
Well, there weren't any reactions, so I think they took it in. A few years ago, 5 years ago, I took the train from Moscow to Vladivostok, the so-called Trans-Siberian Railroad.
Lucky you.
Right. And it was very interesting to, I mean, that width of that country, I don't know whether you mark it from Moscow all the way to the east. But anyway, the width of the country is 2.5 times the width of the United States,
Yes.
and although most of it was very empty, nonetheless, one of my impressions was here is a country of great resources. A lot must lie in those forests and in those fields and under the dirt. Great resources must be there. And the real challenge to me for Russians is to develop their resources and stop this foreign adventurism. That's my impression as a civilian. So
Looks like that, you see. It's Siberia was always the land of promise. Of course, was also the land of exile, but okay, let's not talk about that.
right.
But you see what's going on right now. They are logging, and they sell this raw material very cheaply to China. So the Chinese manufacture finished goods and resell it to Russia and to the rest of the world.
Right.
So it's not very far-sighted, if you ask me.
No. Well, to one of your last themes was the transition for these great powers, the four of them, US, China, Russia, and the EU. Is it possible to move from distrust to constructive dialogue? And you talk a little bit about, and I'd really be interested in your perspective. How is the U.S. viewing China, in your point of view? Wariness of the rise of China. What are your insights about that?
Okay, you said something about four powers. There are actually three powers, but I guess you are. This will be the last point you want me to make, so I will not answer
Well,
immediately.
yeah. Who are the three powers,
Three
from your point of view?
It's not a power. Okay, we'll talk about it later. Anyway, it is. It's becoming more obvious by the day that the United States is viewing China as not just an adversary. It's an emerging enemy.
Yes.
Let's face it, especially in the level of public opinion. Now, public opinion is always excitable, whereas in government, it is always the cooler heads that prevail, or almost always. So, but you can see this by the day now. There was this sitcom, Space Force, at Netflix.
Yes.
I don't know whether you've heard of this, Space Force.
Yes.
And the enemy, of course, is not Russia. Actually, there is a Russian liaison officer in the Space Force headquarters. And of course, he's wreaking havoc in his own way, but he's not really a friend. But he's there. He's a liaison officer. China is the enemy.
Right.
As far as public perception goes, China is the enemy right now. And this has spilled over to popular culture. So it's a great pity because the rest of the world is having a great time with this cooperation, economic cooperation, I mean, between the United States and China. All these floods of cheap goods, come on, it's great. The internet, cheap computers. So you see, you Americans develop the high-tech stuff, and then the Chinese sell us the manufactured computers. Come on, it's great.
Right.
So if there are increasing problems in international trade due to your political rivalry with China, the rest of the world will have to suffer. Of course, this is not your problem, strictly speaking, but it will have adverse consequences. This is my argument.
Okay.
Not a very profound argument. Everybody can see this. You see, none of the points I made seem to be very profound. But you just need to piece them all together. Each point is not really profound in itself. Russian power is declining. The China is looking, United States is looking China as an opponent. All of them are no-brainers taken separately. But the emerging picture might be a little bit original and very frightening.
Yes. Well, also, that goes to your next point. The attitude of China, sensing a strategic opportunity.
Yeah.
And countering with, I think if I understood you, a preventive war, which was maybe Japan's attitude in the late 1930s vis-a-vis the United States. Is that what you meant?
There is something that makes me very, very optimistic. It's called nuclear weapons. I'm a very great proponent of the so-called nuclear peace. Some people with a military background or even civilians who say, oh, there might be a war between great powers. I cannot see this happening because everybody knows that such a war has the potential to blow up the planet.
Right.
Come on, let's face it, the United States and the Soviet Union did not actually fight a hot war, thank God. So if those very ferocious strategic players, both the Americans and the Soviets, with huge ideological differences, we're talking, you know this very well, and with interests clashing throughout the globe, and a rivalry extending for something like almost 50 years, and they didn't fight it out.
Right.
So I cannot see something like that happening between the United States and China. Not even a local clash. It's very, okay, there was this thing that the Chinese were spreading the cruise of the American ship with the water hose, or was it the other way around? I can't recall right now. Some clashes in South China Sea, okay, but no live ammunition was used.
Right.
And because everybody is prudent.
Yeah, it was a measured encounter. A measured encounter. Well, let's bring in some Greek political theory into the picture, into this conversation.
Okay. Yes, okay.
You know what I'm talking about.
This guy, yes, you see it is, of course.
Thucydides' trap.
Yeah, okay. It's obvious, but now, there is the so-called theory of hegemonic war, which is when number one is here and is being approached by number two in terms of power, then there will be a huge conflict. And what is at stake is the governance of the international system. Now, the Cold War was actually a hegemonic war. It did not actually escalate into a full-fledged war between the United States and Soviet Union, but there were tens of millions of people having died around the world in, let's say, so-called peripheral conflicts. So dead is dead everywhere. So it's, we cannot, the Cold War was no peace, right? So it is obvious, or at least it should be obvious, that one way or another, we will have something similar between the United States and China. Thankfully, the economic relationship between United States and China is much healthier than the American-Soviet one. Much healthier, because the Americans and the Soviets weren't interdependent. They were insulated from each other. Okay, the Soviets were importing American grain, but that was about it. Nothing else. Okay, good. No problem.
So we have the economic interdependence to an extent, Well, of course, also you could debate on which was greater volatility. Essentially, you could view the rivalry during the Cold War as an ideological rivalry, a political theory rivalry, which However, with the Chinese, it's an economic rivalry. I mean, we have the trade, of course, but nonetheless, it is an economic rivalry, especially with the Belt and Road
Mm.
Initiative of that they extending their hegemony around the world. So it's kind of a different rivalry. And what would you see as the which is more volatile, if you could even make that judgment? A
Uh,
political theory rivalry or an economic rivalry?
you can never leave politics out.
Yeah.
Never. So in my view, it's a great power rivalry. And
Plain and simple.
the same also applied to the Cold War. Yes, okay, there were somehow communists, but after a while, they were just an old-fashioned Russian oligarchy, the
Right,
Soviet leadership.
right,
So Brezhnev was craving after Swiss watches and all this lovely luxury Western cars and all this stuff. He wasn't really a communist in the sense of the early Bolsheviks.
right,
But still, of course, he was the leader of the greatest communist country on earth. So it's a
right.
great power rivalry. And the same applies to the current situation between US and China. It's, in Europe, uh, we don't so much use the term economics. We prefer the term political economy
Yeah.
because it's inextricably linked with politics. It's not just economic decisions taken in a vacuum. No, it's always political. Let's say, for
Right,
instance, you have those huge oil reserves in the Caspian Sea, the greater Caspian Basin, Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, this natural gas in Turkmenistan, right? Which is economically the cheapest, the most efficient way of bringing these reserves to the international markets is through Iran.
right,
Politically, it's not feasible, full stop, period. You see what I'm saying?
right.
It's never simply economics. If it were simply economics, you Americans, you have built so many huge pipeline network through Iranian territory. Would you ever do this with the current Iranian regime? No.
Right,
You see
right,
what I'm saying? So you cannot really isolate economics from politics. So
right.
I wouldn't say it's a political rivalry or economic rivalry. It's great power rivalry.
Great power.
Great
Now, let me
power.
go to your next to the last point, jumping over one other one to finish with. You say the EU is not a strategic player.
Yeah.
Now, what does that mean to you?
Well, I will borrow the phrase of a great theorist of international relations, Hedley Bull, an Australian guy, who
And what
said
was his name?
Bull, like the animal,
Right,
Bull, Bull. He said that in as much as Europe is not united, the European Union, since it is not united, since it is not a single state, a unitary actor, it is not a power at all.
right,
It's not a power at all. It has a very great role in economic matters because integration has advanced very far in this respect. But it's only there, and even there, it's not completely integrated. So strategically, forget it. There was this saying when I was a student, I don't know whether you have come across it, that Europe is an economic giant, a political dwarf, and a military worm.
right. I hadn't heard that, but it sounds with a lot of truth.
Yeah, I heard it in the early 90s and seems to me very, very true even nowadays. So it's not a strategic player at all. They may
Right,
impose sanctions on Russia because they know that if the Russians do something really bad to them, the Americans will intervene.
right, right. Yeah.
Like the small kid that starts swearing at you or something, and you cannot do anything with him because his father is something like 6'2" and 200 pounds, something like that. So
Right.
this is the case.
Right.
That's
Right.
why they don't
But
do anything against the Turkish transgressions in the Eastern Mediterranean, because the Americans will not lift a finger if
right.
something, if there's a war there between Turkey and Greece or Cyprus or whatever. So you see, they will just leave their mouth shut.
Yeah. Well, they don't have a coordinated foreign policy, and
Absolutely.
no, there's no foreign policy. And it would even be less for any kind of military policy because there are so many attitudes about keeping military spending low. They don't, the capability isn't there.
Yeah, absolutely. I do not
And
expect German boys to die defending Greek islands. And I
right,
wouldn't see I wouldn't like to see Greek boys dying defending Spanish islets against Moroccan aggression.
right,
Simple as that.
right. Well, that goes almost back to the theme of the nation state.
Yeah,
There are elements of national pride and self-interest that exist. Well,
that's the
let's
way.
turn to one of the last real themes here is for Russia, you say there are threats everywhere. If you wouldn't
Absolutely,
mind recapping
absolutely.
that.
Yep. There was. It seems to me I may have pointed this out in the conference as well. There was this Russian ambassador to NATO, Dmitry Rogozin, if I remember correctly, and he said, "Well, we have been invaded from the east, from the west, from the south. Thank God we have only polar bears at the north." Nowadays, actually, there may be threats emanating even from the north, or at least perceived threats. There may not be actual threats, but this is how they might look like in Moscow, even from the north, due to the melting of the ice cap.
Right.
They have done a very admirable work, the Russians and the Norwegians. A few years ago, actually quite a few years ago, it was 2011, if I remember correctly, 2010, something like that, that they signed a very equitable agreement in maritime zone delimitation. Very good, very statesmanlike. Because you see, in the ice cap, it seems so far at least that most resources happen to be located within the exclusive economic zones of,
Right.
say, of the states that are
Right.
being watched by the Arctic Ocean. So there's much less potential for conflict that meets the eye. But still, there might be threats even from there.
Right.
There is a threat from the west. There is a potential threat from the south, beginning from the North Caucasus area, Chechnya, Dagestan. Oh, okay, we all know what can happen there and what has happened. Also, the Central Asian states. There was this revolution in Kyrgyzstan. Okay, it's not something that
But it's an area of
I don't know
trouble.
what your Kyrgyz guy told you because I saw your post on Facebook, something about this guy from Kyrgyzstan that you had to talk about,
Right.
right? So
Right.
it seems to me that you made a post.
Yeah.
You had
Yes.
a chat with a guy
Right.
from Kyrgyzstan. So, but this is also potentially a threat. Afghanistan, after the Americans leave, might once again turn unstable. You don't know what might happen there and how this might influence the Russian near abroad. And of course, there is a latent threat from China. Now, this is very interesting because the Moscow and Beijing have been very pragmatic in their bilateral relationship. I have to confess that I had made a prediction and it has failed miserably. I was expecting the old Sino-Soviet conflict to erupt again. Yeah, I could see some tensions also increasing in the Russian Far East, but nothing of the sort has happened. And it is obvious that both political leaderships have been displaying very great care and very admirable statesmanship in managing the relationship.
Right.
It's great. It's great. It's really awesome. Because you see, when you have two great powers bordering each other, there's always bound to be some clashes. No, nothing of the sort is happening.
Yeah.
And you Americans have to take credit or blame for this.
Right. That's right.
You get the idea.
Well, we're pushing Russia into the embrace of China.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's right. But
And
as you say,
and vice
each of the
versa.
each of these regimes are pragmatic in their approach, pragmatic rather than dogmatic, as the
Yeah,
U.S. seems to be.
seems to be, especially your Congress.
Right. Well, that is true. That's right. Well, this all is saying that we have to speak again. We'll have to have another chat over some interval, and I really appreciate you going back over through your points, and I look forward to any expansion that you may produce from the slide deck and your comments. It's very, very thought-provoking.
I also expect, I have to thank you for your initiative, and I do expect some feedback from people that might possibly listen to this video.
Right, that's right. We'll put that up.
Mhm.
Well, thanks very much.
Thank you so much,
Excellent.
Bill.
Great to see you. Okay.
Take care. All the best.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Good weekend.
Good weekend.